Go ahead, Ethan said as the applause rolled across the deck. Put the ring on her finger. My wife isn't coming. Those 11 words should have sounded like confidence. Instead, they became the beginning of the one story every guest aboard that 80-foot yacht would spend years trying to explain. No one knew why the billionaire smiled so easily that evening. No one questioned why champagne flowed like water or why a string quartet played beneath a sky painted gold by the last light of a July sunset. Wealth has a way of convincing people that everything they see is exactly what it appears to be. But expensive lies still crack under the weight of one unexpected truth. My name is Evelyn Carter, and everyone on that yacht believed I was lying in a private maternity suite across town, under strict doctor's orders to avoid stress until my baby arrived. Even my husband believed it. Especially my husband. That was the first mistake he made. The second was far more expensive. As Ethan Whitmore raised a crystal glass before investors, celebrities, politicians, and friends who had admired our marriage for years, he thanked everyone for celebrating what he called a new beginning. Those words drifted across the ocean breeze with remarkable ease, as though the old beginning had never existed. Standing beside him was Vanessa Collins, dressed in a white designer gown that looked strangely familiar. It took only a heartbeat for several guests to recognize why. It had been custom-made from sketches Ethan once commissioned for our 10th wedding anniversary. Nobody said a word. They simply exchanged uncomfortable glances before choosing silence over honesty. Silence is remarkably affordable when surrounded by billionaires. Ethan smiled, reached into the pocket of his tailored navy jacket, and removed a velvet box. The deck erupted into cheers before anyone even saw what rested inside. Cameras lifted. Phones recorded. Every lens pointed toward the promise of another glamorous headline. America loves watching wealthy people celebrate themselves. It almost never expects the celebration to collapse before dessert is served. Vanessa extended her hand with practiced elegance. Ethan opened the box. A diamond the size of a marble reflected the evening sun, scattering tiny flashes of light across polished teak floors and designer shoes worth more than some families earned in a month. Then, just as the ring touched her finger, another voice cut cleanly through the applause. Before you congratulate them, I think my husband forgot to introduce his wife. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every conversation stopped on its own. Even the violinist lowered his bow before the final note had finished trembling in the air. Heads turned together toward the boarding platform. A single woman stood there wearing a pale blue maternity dress beneath a long ivory coat that moved gently with the ocean wind. One hand rested calmly over the curve of her 7-month pregnancy. The other held nothing except a simple cream-colored envelope. No jewelry, no security team, no anger visible from where anyone stood. Only a quiet expression that unsettled the room far more than shouting ever could. Ethan's smile disappeared so quickly that several guests later insisted they imagined it. Vanessa blinked once, then twice, as though the woman before her belonged to another reality entirely. Nobody understood how Evelyn Carter had reached the yacht. Nobody knew who had brought her there. But the greatest mystery wasn't how she arrived. It was why she looked so peaceful while every powerful person on that deck suddenly looked terrified. Ethan Whitmore had spent 12 years mastering one simple belief. If he controlled the story, he controlled the truth. That belief built a fortune, won magazine covers, and convinced nearly everyone around him that confidence was the same thing as integrity. It also convinced him that his pregnant wife would never interrupt the carefully choreographed future he had already planned without her. 12 hours earlier, the city had awakened beneath a blanket of summer heat. Across town, in the private maternity wing of St. Catherine Medical Center, Evelyn Carter opened her eyes before sunrise. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and antiseptic, while the steady rhythm of a heart monitor quietly marked each passing second. Her physician had repeated the same instructions for the 3rd consecutive day. Rest. No emotional stress. No unnecessary travel. At 7 months pregnant, every decision mattered. Evelyn had nodded politely, thanked the medical staff, and waited until the hallway outside her room became silent. She had not argued because arguments waste energy. She had learned that lesson years ago. Instead, she watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the window until they reached the cream-colored envelope resting inside the drawer beside her bed. It had arrived the previous evening with no return address, delivered by a courier who disappeared before anyone could ask questions. Inside was a single invitation embossed with gold lettering. Ethan Whitmore and Vanessa Collins request the honor of your presence as they celebrate a new beginning aboard the Azure Crown. At first, Evelyn assumed it had to be fake. Then she noticed something almost everyone else would have missed. The event began exactly 30 minutes before Ethan's board meeting with several international investors. That timing was impossible to ignore. Ethan never mixed personal celebrations with business unless he expected both to produce the same result. Beneath the invitation rested one handwritten sentence. If you want the truth, be there before sunset. There was no signature, no explanation, just enough mystery to replace confusion with certainty. Someone wanted her to witness something, or perhaps someone wanted her to stop it. Evelyn quietly closed the envelope and looked toward the framed ultrasound photograph sitting beside fresh flowers on the windowsill. The tiny profile of her unborn daughter reminded her that fear had become an unaffordable luxury. She reached for her phone. There were no missed calls from Ethan, no messages asking how she felt, no questions about the latest appointment. His last text had arrived nearly 20 hours earlier. Busy day? Get some rest. Love you. She read those 3 words several times before setting the phone aside. Strange how love could become the shortest sentence and the longest distance at exactly the same time. Shortly after 8 o'clock that morning, her closest friend, Olivia Brooks, entered the room carrying breakfast from the cafe downstairs. Olivia stopped immediately after seeing the invitation lying on the blanket. She did not ask who sent it. She simply whispered, "You already know, do not you?" Evelyn answered with a slow nod. "I think I have known for much longer than I wanted to admit." Olivia pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Then promise me one thing. Whatever happens today, do not let them decide who you become." Evelyn smiled softly, although exhaustion lingered behind her eyes. "They already decided that months ago. Today is simply the first time they will discover they were wrong." Outside the hospital window, a helicopter crossed the afternoon sky toward the coastline. Evelyn watched it disappear beyond the skyline, unaware that before the sun touched the horizon, every person aboard one luxury yacht would be forced to question everything they believed about the perfect life they had been admiring from a distance. By 4:30 that afternoon, the Azure Crown floated a quarter-mile beyond the marina, surrounded by smaller escort boats and framed by calm blue water that reflected the fading summer sky. From a distance, it looked less like a yacht and more like a floating palace. White decks gleamed beneath strings of warm lights. Uniformed servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks and carefully prepared hors d'oeuvres. Soft jazz drifted across the breeze while photographers positioned themselves for the evening's most anticipated announcement. To every guest stepping aboard, the event represented success. To one person, it represented the final chapter of a carefully constructed illusion. Ethan Whitmore greeted each arrival with effortless confidence. He shook hands with venture capital executives from Silicon Valley, welcomed financial reporters from New York, and laughed easily with celebrities whose faces regularly appeared on magazine covers beside his own. His reputation had become one of his company's greatest assets. Investors trusted numbers, but they invested in image. Ethan understood that better than anyone. Standing beside him, Vanessa Collins looked completely at home among the elite crowd. She wore the white gown with quiet satisfaction, accepting compliments as though the evening belonged to her alone. Every few minutes someone asked how long they had known each other. Ethan always answered with the same polished smile. Long enough to know that life sometimes surprises you. The guests laughed politely, never realizing how carefully rehearsed every sentence had become. Near the upper deck, members of the Whitmore board gathered around polished teak tables overlooking the ocean. Charles Donovan, the company's oldest director, watched the celebration without touching the champagne resting in front of him. He had spent nearly 3 decades helping build Whitmore Capital into one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms. Something about tonight unsettled him. Perhaps it was the unusual timing. Perhaps it was the absence of Ethan's wife. Or perhaps it was the growing feeling that too much effort had been invested in making everything appear effortless. Across the deck, Ethan's chief financial officer, Daniel Harper, quietly checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His phone had received 2 missed calls from the corporate legal department that afternoon, both marked urgent. Ethan had dismissed them without even reading the messages. Tomorrow, he had said. Tonight is about moving forward. Daniel wanted to believe him. Yet experience had taught him that problems, ignored, rarely disappeared. They usually arrived at the worst possible moment. As sunset painted the horizon with shades of orange and crimson, a famous television host stepped onto the small stage positioned near the bow of the yacht. Guests gathered naturally, conversations fading into expectant silence. Cameras rotated toward Ethan and Vanessa as they approached together. Crystal glasses reflected the evening light, while drones hovered discreetly overhead, capturing every elegant detail for tomorrow's headlines. The host smiled broadly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining one of the most remarkable evenings of the summer. Tonight is about fresh beginnings, bold decisions, and the future. Applause spread across the deck. Ethan accepted the microphone with practiced ease. Every successful journey reaches a moment when honesty becomes more important than comfort, he began. Sometimes choosing happiness requires difficult decisions. Several guests nodded approvingly, unaware that those words carried entirely different meanings depending on who happened to be listening. Vanessa slipped her hand gently into his. Camera shutters clicked almost continuously now. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, Daniel noticed one empty place setting that had remained untouched since the staff finished arranging dinner. The elegant name card beside it read only 2 words. Mrs. Whitmore. He frowned. Nobody else seemed to notice it. At almost the exact same moment, the yacht's captain received a brief radio transmission from the marina. He listened quietly, glanced toward the boarding platform, and his expression changed so subtly that only one crew member noticed. Without saying another word, he folded the radio into his jacket pocket and turned toward the entrance where a single unexpected arrival was only moments away. Evelyn Carter did not rush. She stepped onto the boarding platform with the measured confidence of someone who had already survived the hardest part of the day. The evening breeze lifted a loose strand of her chestnut hair as she adjusted the ivory coat resting lightly over her shoulders. One hand remained protectively over her growing baby, while the other held the cream-colored envelope as though it weighed almost nothing. Yet somehow, every eye aboard the yacht became fixed on that simple envelope instead of the woman carrying it. Conversations dissolved into whispers. The soft music faded naturally as the musicians lowered their instruments, uncertain whether they were witnessing an unexpected guest or the beginning of something far more significant. Ethan remained frozen for one brief second. It was barely noticeable, but Daniel Harper saw it immediately. The billionaire who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without changing his heartbeat had suddenly forgotten what expression belonged on his own face. Then, almost mechanically, Ethan forced another smile. "Evelyn," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You should be resting." His words sounded gentle. His eyes did not. Evelyn returned the smile with remarkable calm. "That is thoughtful of you," she answered. "Although I could not imagine missing such an important celebration." Vanessa folded her arms with a polite smile that failed to hide her uncertainty. She had expected tears. She had expected accusations. She had prepared herself for an emotional confrontation that security could quietly escort away from the cameras. She had not prepared for a woman who looked completely composed. Confidence can be rehearsed. Peace cannot. The television host glanced nervously between the 3 of them before attempting to rescue the evening. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with an awkward laugh. "What a wonderful surprise. We did not know you would be joining us." Evelyn shifted her attention toward him, never raising her voice. "Neither did I until this morning." The answer seemed harmless, yet it settled over the crowd like an unanswered question. Several reporters instinctively lowered their cameras for a moment, sensing that the story they had arrived to cover was quietly transforming into something entirely different. Charles Donovan watched Evelyn carefully from across the deck. During board dinners over the years, he had always found her gracious, intelligent, and unusually observant. She rarely spoke simply to fill silence. When she finally chose her words, people usually remembered them. Charles noticed that she had not once looked at the diamond ring still resting inside Ethan's open hand. Instead, her eyes traveled slowly across the assembled investors, executives, and longtime family friends, almost as though she wanted every face committed to memory. Daniel stepped closer to Ethan and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. Do you want me to stop the presentation? Ethan answered without moving his lips. No, this changes nothing. But Daniel no longer believed him. Across the deck, two reporters exchanged uncertain glances. One whispered, was she invited? The other shook his head. If she was, nobody told the press. The mystery only deepened. Evelyn finally climbed the last step onto the main deck. The polished wood reflected the warm lights above, making the entire yacht appear almost dreamlike against the darkening ocean. She paused only long enough to remove her coat, revealing the elegant pale blue maternity dress beneath. There was nothing extravagant about it. No designer logo. No expensive jewelry. Somehow its simplicity made everyone else appear overdressed. She walked toward Ethan until only a few feet separated them. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched just long enough for the gentle sound of waves brushing against the hull to become unmistakably clear. Then Evelyn looked at the velvet ring box still resting in his hand before lifting her gaze back to his face. You know, she said softly, all afternoon I kept wondering whether I was coming here to hear another lie, or finally learn the truth. Ethan inhaled slowly, searching for the confident answer that had always come so naturally. Before he could speak, Evelyn lifted the cream-colored envelope slightly and added, Fortunately, someone made sure I would not have to choose. At that exact moment, more than one guest realized the envelope was not the surprise. Whatever had been placed inside it was. Instead of opening the envelope, Evelyn lowered it to her side and looked slowly across the faces gathered on the deck. Before anyone assumes I came here to ruin a celebration, she said, I would like to tell you a story. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle, yet every person leaned in as though instinct told them not to miss a single word. Even the ocean seemed quieter. 12 years ago, I met a young entrepreneur with more ambition than money. He believed every impossible dream could become real if someone believed in him first. She smiled faintly, not at Ethan, but at the memory itself. I believed him. Several older investors exchanged glances. They remembered those years. They remembered Ethan before magazine covers, before private jets, before his company became a household name on financial television. Evelyn continued without hurry. Our first apartment measured less than 900 square feet. The kitchen sink leaked every winter. The heater stopped working whenever the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. We laughed anyway because we believed we were building something together. A quiet chuckle escaped Charles Donovan before he quickly looked away. He remembered visiting that apartment during Ethan's first fundraising campaign. Everything Evelyn described was true. Ethan shifted his weight slightly. Evelyn, he interrupted with a polite smile that looked increasingly strained. This is not the time. She turned toward him with complete calm. You are right. It is long overdue. The words settled over the crowd with surprising weight. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. She continued. People often ask what success changes. They imagine larger homes, nicer vacations, expensive watches, beautiful yachts. Her eyes drifted toward the lights reflecting across the water. But sometimes success changes something much quieter. It changes the conversations that stop happening. Vanessa crossed her arms. I think everyone understands that marriages are complicated. Evelyn nodded kindly. They are. Especially when only one person knows the marriage is ending. A ripple of uneasy whispers spread through the guests. Reporters no longer tried hiding their recording devices. Every microphone had quietly found its way toward Evelyn. She never acknowledged them. Do you know what surprised me most? She asked. It was never the canceled dinners. It was not the missed anniversaries. It was not even the business trips that became longer every month. She paused briefly. It was how invisible honesty becomes once enough people start admiring appearances. Daniel lowered his eyes. The sentence struck him harder than he expected. During the past year, he had noticed Ethan becoming increasingly secretive. New meetings appeared without explanation. Certain expenses passed through executive accounts with unusual urgency. Whenever Daniel asked questions, Ethan always smiled and said, "Leave the personal matters to me." Daniel had accepted that answer more times than he cared to remember. Now he wondered whether silence had made him part of the illusion. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a folded ultrasound photograph. She held it gently between her fingers rather than displaying it dramatically. Every appointment, she said softly, I hoped her father would be there. She looked down at the tiny image before smiling again. Sometimes he came. Most of the time he called afterward and asked if everything went well. Ethan looked away toward the horizon. The movement lasted less than a second, but cameras captured it anyway. Vanessa finally stepped forward. "This is unfair," she said carefully. "None of us knows everything about another person's relationship." Evelyn looked at her with remarkable kindness. "You are absolutely correct." She folded the photograph and slipped it back into her pocket. "That is exactly why I am not asking anyone to choose sides tonight." Those words confused everyone. If she had not come to accuse anyone publicly, then why had she come at all? Charles glanced once more toward the cream-colored envelope still resting quietly in Evelyn's hand. Suddenly, he understood something that made his heartbeat quicken. She had not spoken a single sentence without purpose. Every memory, every pause, every smile had been leading somewhere else. The envelope had remained closed from the moment she stepped aboard, which meant the most important part of her story had not even begun. For the first time that evening, Evelyn finally broke the seal on the cream-colored envelope. The sound of paper unfolding was almost imperceptible, yet in the silence that had settled across the deck, it seemed louder than the ocean surrounding them. She glanced at the first page only briefly before looking back at the guests. "I did not bring these documents because I wanted sympathy," she said. "I brought them because every important decision deserves complete information." Ethan took one cautious step forward. "Evelyn, whatever someone sent you, there is an explanation." She smiled gently. "I hope there is. I truly do." She removed 3 neatly organized folders from the envelope and handed the first one to Charles Donovan. "You have known my husband longer than almost anyone here. I think you should read the first page." Charles accepted the folder with visible hesitation. His eyes moved across the opening paragraphs. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. He flipped to the second page, then the third, reading more quickly each time. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly. Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Someone decided I deserved to know what had been happening while I was being told everything was fine." Ethan reached toward the folder. "Charles, do not look at documents without verifying the source." Charles did not hand it back. Instead, he turned toward Daniel Harper. "You should read this." Daniel accepted the folder. His experience as chief financial officer allowed him to recognize accounting records almost instantly. Company reimbursement reports, wire transfer summaries, executive authorization forms, expense approvals. Nothing looked unusual until he reached the highlighted sections. Several luxury purchases listed as corporate client entertainment had been authorized over the previous 11 months. Jewelry, international resort reservations, private charter flights, boutique hotel suites. Every expense carried the same executive approval code. Ethan Whitmore. Daniel frowned. "These came through corporate accounts." Ethan answered immediately. "Context matters. Those were business development expenses." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "That is certainly one way to describe them." She removed a second folder and handed it directly to one of the outside board members, Margaret Ellis, a retired federal judge known for her careful attention to detail. Margaret adjusted her glasses before opening the file. Inside were photographs, travel itineraries, and matching calendar entries. Business conferences that had never existed. Investor dinners attended by no investors. Strategy meetings scheduled on weekends when the executive office had remained completely closed. Margaret slowly lowered the papers. "These dates correspond exactly," she murmured. "Every document supports the others." Vanessa's confidence finally began to crack. "This proves nothing," she insisted. "People travel together for work all the time." Evelyn looked toward her with surprising compassion. "Perhaps they do." Then she reached into the envelope one final time and removed a slim flash drive sealed inside a transparent evidence bag. She never held it up dramatically. She simply placed it on the nearest table beside the unopened champagne glasses. "The courier who sent these documents included something else," she explained. "A complete backup of company scheduling records, reimbursement approvals, and internal email confirmations. I have not even watched everything myself." A murmur swept across the guests. Several investors instinctively checked their phones. Within moments, notifications began appearing across the deck almost simultaneously. Daniel looked down at his screen. An emergency email from corporate legal had just arrived. Subject line, "Immediate board review required." He opened it. The legal department had independently discovered accounting irregularities less than an hour earlier and was requesting an emergency meeting before the overseas market opened the following morning. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward Ethan. This was no longer a private marital dispute. The questions now reached far beyond one relationship. Charles closed the folder carefully before looking directly at Ethan. "We can discuss personal choices another day," he said in a calm voice that somehow carried across the silent deck. "Tonight, however, we need to discuss whether every decision made under your leadership has been worthy of the trust placed in you." As those words settled over the gathering, Ethan's phone began vibrating again. Then another executive's phone rang. Then another. One by one, screens across the yacht illuminated with the same urgent headlines, and for the first time all evening, the wealthiest man aboard realized he was no longer controlling the story. The silence lasted only a few seconds before reality began arriving one notification at a time. Phones vibrated across the yacht like falling dominoes. Investors stepped away from the crowd to answer urgent calls. Two board members quietly moved toward the stern, speaking in low voices that grew noticeably more serious with every passing moment. The television host slipped his microphone onto a nearby table, suddenly aware that the evening had transformed into something no script could rescue. Ethan looked around the deck as though searching for one familiar face that still believed everything could be explained away. Instead, he found uncertainty everywhere. Daniel Harper finally broke the silence. "The legal department has requested an emergency board session at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Attendance is mandatory." Ethan forced a measured smile. "Then we will have the meeting. We will review everything." Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked down once more at the email before speaking. "They have already retained outside counsel." Those 4 words landed with remarkable weight. Outside counsel meant the questions had grown beyond internal discussion. Charles Donovan folded the financial records neatly before handing them to Margaret Ellis. "Please secure these," he said calmly. "No copies leave this deck until the board reviews every page." Margaret nodded without hesitation. Her years on the bench had taught her that facts deserved patience, while assumptions deserved restraint. Vanessa stepped closer to Ethan, lowering her voice. "Say something. Tell them this is all fabricated." Ethan opened his mouth, but for perhaps the first time in his professional life, no convincing sentence arrived. Every explanation required trust, and trust had quietly begun leaving the yacht one guest at a time. Across the deck, a venture capital partner from Boston approached Daniel. "Our investment committee has a conference call in 20 minutes, he said. "Until these issues are clarified, we are postponing tomorrow's announcement." Daniel simply nodded. He had expected that answer before the man even finished speaking. Nearby, another investor quietly instructed his assistant to cancel the morning press conference that had been scheduled to celebrate Whitmore Capital's newest expansion. Reporters noticed the sudden movement immediately. Cameras shifted away from the ring still resting inside the velvet box and toward the executives leaving in small groups. Without raising her voice, Evelyn remained exactly where she had been standing since opening the envelope. She watched events unfold without satisfaction or celebration. Olivia's words from the hospital echoed quietly in her memory. "Do not let them decide who you become." She understood now that revenge would have been easy. Remaining calm required much greater strength. Ethan finally turned toward her. "Did you plan all of this?" His question carried less anger than exhaustion. Evelyn met his eyes. "No," she answered honestly. "I planned to learn the truth. What happened afterward belonged to everyone else's decisions." Charles approached them slowly. "Ethan, as your friend, I wish this evening had never happened." He paused before continuing. "As a director, I cannot ignore what I have seen." Ethan lowered his head briefly. "You are assuming guilt before an investigation." "No," Charles replied. "I am protecting the company until the investigation reaches its conclusion." There is a difference. The distinction mattered, and everyone present understood it. One by one, guests began thanking the crew before quietly making arrangements to return to shore. Conversations centered no longer on celebrations or new beginnings, but on audits, governance, fiduciary responsibility, and unanswered questions. Even the musicians packed away their instruments without being asked. The cheerful melodies that had welcomed the evening never returned. Vanessa looked toward the dock where small transport boats had begun approaching to collect departing guests. The glamorous night she had imagined had dissolved into careful silence and uncomfortable headlines that would dominate financial news by sunrise. She glanced toward Ethan, expecting reassurance, but found only a man staring across dark water as though searching for a future that had suddenly drifted beyond reach. Then, just as another transport boat touched the yacht's platform, Daniel received one final message from corporate headquarters. He read it once, looked toward Charles, and quietly said, "The board chair has just called. Effective immediately, they want Mr. Whitmore to refrain from making any executive decisions until tomorrow's review is complete." For the second time that night, every conversation stopped. Ethan stood motionless as the last echoes of conversation faded into the night. The ocean that had looked so peaceful only an hour earlier now reflected scattered lights from the departing boats, each one carrying away another witness to the unraveling of the image he had spent years creating. He slowly closed the velvet ring box and slipped it into his jacket without looking at Vanessa. For the first time since Evelyn stepped aboard, he seemed less concerned about the crowd than about the woman standing quietly in front of him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the polished confidence that had impressed boardrooms across the country. Evelyn studied him for a moment before nodding once. Neither of them moved far. They simply stepped toward the quieter side of the upper deck, where only the sound of gentle waves reached them. The distance between them measured only a few feet, yet it felt greater than the 12 years they had shared together. Ethan looked down briefly before speaking again. "I never wanted tonight to happen like this." Evelyn answered with calm honesty. "Neither did I." He exhaled slowly. "I thought I could separate my personal life from everything else. I kept telling myself that I would explain everything when the timing was better." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "There is never a perfect time to tell the truth after choosing silence." Those words lingered between them. Ethan looked toward the dark horizon. "I convinced myself that protecting my reputation would eventually protect everyone else." Evelyn gave a faint, almost sympathetic smile. "That is the strange thing about reputation. The harder people chase it, the easier they forget to protect their character." Behind them, crew members quietly began clearing untouched dinner tables. Crystal glasses remained nearly full. Elegant centerpieces still decorated tables where nobody intended to return. The celebration had ended long before the scheduled dinner was ever served. Vanessa approached cautiously before stopping several yards away. She looked at Ethan as though waiting for him to deny everything, to defend her, or simply to choose one direction. Instead, he remained silent. That silence answered more questions than any speech could have. Vanessa lowered her eyes. "I should leave," she whispered. Ethan did not stop her. He did not follow her. She turned and walked toward one of the waiting transport boats without looking back. Several photographers watched quietly but lowered their cameras. Somehow the moment felt too human to exploit. Charles Donovan joined Daniel Harper near the rail overlooking the marina. "Do you think he understands what tomorrow will bring?" Daniel looked across the dark water before answering. "I think tomorrow is no longer the day he fears most." Charles nodded slowly. He understood exactly what Daniel meant. Companies could recover from leadership changes. Financial losses could eventually be repaired. Trust rarely returns so easily. Ethan finally turned back toward Evelyn. "I cannot change what has already happened." "No," she replied softly. "None of us can." He hesitated before asking the one question he had avoided all evening. "Is there any chance we can begin again?" Evelyn rested one hand gently over her unborn daughter before reaching with the other toward the wedding band she had worn every day for 12 years. She slid it from her finger with quiet deliberation. There was no anger in the gesture, no dramatic flourish, only acceptance. She looked at the simple gold ring resting in her palm for a long moment before placing it carefully beside the unopened champagne bottle on the nearest table. "This ring reminded me every day of the promises we made," she said. "Tonight it reminds me that promises only matter when both people continue choosing them." Ethan stared silently at the ring. He did not reach for it. He seemed to understand that some decisions could not be undone simply because regret arrived too late. Evelyn stepped back one pace, offering him a final expression of kindness rather than resentment. "I truly hope you become the man you always believed you were," she said. "But I cannot build my daughter's future on hope alone." With those words, She turned toward the waiting dock, leaving the ring exactly where it rested beneath the warm glow of the deck lights. While Ethan remained standing beside the life he had finally realized he could no longer reclaim. 6 months later, the headlines had moved on. Financial networks found new companies to celebrate. Social media discovered new scandals to debate. The cameras that once followed Ethan Whitmore everywhere had quietly disappeared, replaced by stories about younger entrepreneurs with cleaner reputations and brighter futures. Markets always recovered. Public attention always shifted. But some lessons continued long after the audience stopped watching. On a crisp spring morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the newly renovated Carter Family Resource Center, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting single mothers and young families rebuilding their lives. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Children's laughter echoed through bright hallways painted in warm colors instead of polished marble and expensive glass. It was not the grandest building in the city. Yet everyone who walked inside immediately felt something far more valuable than luxury. They felt welcome. Evelyn Carter stood near the front entrance holding her infant daughter, Grace, whose curious blue eyes wandered across every smiling face entering the building. Grace reached toward the morning light dancing across the floor, completely unaware that before she was born, her future had nearly been defined by decisions she never made. Olivia Brooks adjusted a ribbon tied around the dedication plaque and smiled at her lifelong friend. "Ready?" she asked softly. Evelyn looked around the room filled with volunteers, teachers, nurses, local business owners, and families who had donated their time rather than their status. She smiled with quiet certainty. "I have been ready for a long time." As the ribbon was gently untied, applause filled the room. It sounded different from the applause that had echoed across the yacht months earlier. That applause celebrated appearances. This applause celebrated purpose. Charles Donovan attended the ceremony without making any announcement of his arrival. He quietly shook Evelyn's hand before looking at Grace. "She has your eyes," he said with a warm smile. Evelyn laughed softly. "Thankfully." Charles nodded. "The board completed its review 3 months ago." Evelyn never asked for details. She simply listened. "The company survived," Charles continued. "New leadership accepted responsibility for rebuilding trust. It will take years, but they are trying." Evelyn appreciated the honesty. "I hope they succeed," she answered sincerely. Charles studied her expression for a moment. "You really mean that? Holding on to bitterness would only teach my daughter the wrong lesson." Across town, Ethan walked alone through a neighborhood park where spring leaves had begun covering the sidewalks with patches of fresh green. His life looked very different now. The board investigation had ended. Leadership had changed. His ownership remained, but his authority no longer carried the unquestioned confidence it once had. More importantly, the silence waiting inside his home every evening reminded him that success could purchase almost anything except another chance to make the right choice at the right time. A small package rested in his hands. Inside was a children's picture book he had found at a neighborhood bookstore. He stared at it for several moments before quietly placing it back into the gift bag. Some gifts, he understood, could not erase years of absence. Later that afternoon, he arrived quietly at the resource center after learning about its opening through a local newspaper. He remained outside across the street, watching families enter with smiles that required no expensive invitations. Through the large front windows, he saw Evelyn kneeling beside Grace, helping her tiny daughter reach for colorful wooden blocks scattered across a playmat. Mother and daughter laughed together, completely unaware that he was standing there. Ethan smiled sadly before turning away. He realized that interrupting their peace simply to ease his own conscience would be another selfish decision. Some forms of love meant knowing when your presence no longer served the people you cared about. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the city, Evelyn lifted Grace into her arms and looked through the window toward the bright sky. She did not see the man who had already walked away. She only saw the future waiting ahead. The most remarkable thing about that future was not that it had become easier. It was that she no longer needed someone else's promises to believe it would be beautiful. Sometimes the richest person in the room is not the one who owns the yacht. It is the one who finally learns that dignity, truth, and peace cannot be purchased, only protected.